get our sound turned on this morning. Hey, anybody out in Facebook land, if Buford has the camera too close to me, y'all let him know. Can't trust your preacher sometimes, what he's doing. Good morning. Hope you've had a good week and getting ready for Christmas, because I think everybody and their brother was out yesterday, so we came home because of that. This morning, we're going to continue our study of King David. You know, we've been talking about him for several weeks now, and the ups and the downs of his life. Last week, if you remembered, we had looked at his son Absalom, and if you remember before that, Absalom, there was some family issues, and because Absalom's brother Amnon raped their sister Tamar, he killed him. And remember that he was sent out of the country, away from David and out of his sight. And then Joab, the general of David, had asked him, had brought him back. And when he came back and he found favor with David again, we remember that he started plotting to take over the kingdom from David, that he started sitting at the gates, and that he was counseling the people, and that he was acting like he was one of them and acting like he cared about what they felt. He was kissing them. Like we said, you always typically, one of the things people laugh about politicians is kissing babies and stuff. And if we remember, that's what Absalom was doing. He was winning over the hearts of David's people slowly, in front of David even. But being David's son, if you had a position of authority and your child took interest and you could help, you're generally not going to look at them with a critical eye thinking they're going to do anything. You're going to be proud of them and promote them and hope they do well, and who knows, maybe someday they'll do whatever you're doing and take over at that point. But Absalom had other ideas. He meant to take over the kingdom from David, so he was trying to steal the people. And, we said he left town with 200 of the prominent citizens, so he wanted to make himself really visible, and he wanted to take that kingdom over. And he was, I guess, kind of like a cancer in something. He was just slowly undercover trying to do stuff, and then it became really a blatant sore. So when we left last time, David had left Jerusalem. They started to bring the ark out behind him, and David said, no, put the ark back in the capital, Jerusalem, where it belongs. He didn't want to take it out of that, and he said, if the Lord wants me in this place to have that, he'll bring me back to the capital city. So we're starting this week at 2 Samuel chapter 18. The title of this lesson is Absalom's Death and David's Grief. And we see, it seems throughout David's life, although he's had the king of the land, he's had his share of grief and troubles. He's had access to any riches that he wanted to have, and he's had a relationship with the Lord that we've seen that he keeps the Lord. But there's some times that he's let down his guard, and there's some times that he's done some things that we see as you reap what you sow, that he's, some of these things in his past are staying with him. But, we've talked about David. David, in spite of, stays with the Lord. In spite of the grief, whatever happens to him, David doesn't abandon the Lord and say, all is lost, woe is me, I'll just go down in despair. He always remembers. And a couple weeks ago, if we remember, we read some of the Psalms that he had written, one that was in grief and despair, and he was crying out to the Lord. And then the second Psalm we studied, it was after this period that he was praising the Lord. And I've heard of a couple preachers this week talking about grief and praise. And they were saying sometimes while you're in the middle of the grief, you need to start the praise. Don't wait till everything's good that the Lord loves your praises, and when you're praising the Lord, it uplifts and helps you to forget about the griefs that you had. So there's a lot from David that we can learn from, that we see every week. So as we study and we talk about it, remember to kind of apply this to your life, what you could do different. We don't live in the time, and we're not out in the physical battlefield with spears and swords like they are, but we are in a spiritual battlefield every day. If you pay attention, you can see some similarities between the physical and the spiritual that we have. The golden text for today says, "A foolish son is a grief to his father, and bitterness to her that bare him." And our lesson aim is young people should learn to live right before God and in obedience to parents. And that's not all just the young people. Parents should learn the necessity of training their children in obedience and righteousness. So it's hard for us to expect something from our children if we don't take the time to teach them these things. If we let them run renegade and then we expect them to know the things they should know, it's not going to happen that way. It just you have to take time and teach your kids. And sometimes it's a little late, but people that have spent their whole life working to make a little extra money, they realize that in pursuit of this money, that they've let their kids, they don't even know their kids. And, most of the time if you ask a kid what they want, it's not toys they'll say they want toys and stuff, but more than that, they want your time. I mean, they would rather have you out in the yard throwing a ball with them and talking than buying them something. It's that time, which is something you can't buy back. When it's gone, it's gone. And, those of us having grown kids, and especially those of us having grown kids that moved to Florida, because I hope she's watching right now. If you haven't spent time with them, you need to take every precious minute that you have and then go to Florida when you can. So let's get started on this lesson. I'll go ahead and read. We're starting at 2 Samuel chapter 18. We're going to read 9 through 17, and then we're going to read verses 32 and 33. It says, "And Absalom met the servants of David, and Absalom rode upon a mule, and the mule went under the thick boughs of a great oak, and his head caught hold of the oak, and he was taken up between the heaven and the earth, and the mule that was under him went away. And a certain man saw it, and told Joab, and said, Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. And Joab said unto the men that told him, And behold, thou sawest him. Why didst thou not smite him there to the ground? And I would have given thee 10 shekels of silver and a girdle. And the man said to Joab, Though I would receive 1,000 shekels of silver in mine hand, yet would I not put forth my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king charged thee and Abishai and Ittai, saying, Beware that none touch the young man Absalom. Otherwise I should have wrought falsehood against mine own life, for there is no matter hid from the king, and thou thyself would have set yourself against me. Then said Joab, I would not tarry thus with thee. And he took 3 darts into his hand, and thrust them into the heart of Absalom, while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. And 10 young men that bare Joab's armor compassed about, and smote Absalom, and slew him. And Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing after Israel, for Joab held back the people. And they took Absalom, and cast him into a great pit in the wood, and laid a very great heap of stones upon him. And all Israel fled, every one to his tent. And the king said unto Cushai, Is the young man Absalom safe? And Cushai answered, The enemies of my lord the king, and all that rise against thee to do thee hurt, be as that young man is. And the king was much moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate, and wept. As he went, thus he said, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son." So we see here that, like I said, we talked about last week, that Absalom had taken over the kingdom and he was coming after David to kill him. So although David had this great love for Absalom, it seems that that love wasn't reciprocal, that Absalom meant to kill David, and their primary target was David. You know, they didn't necessarily want to hurt the armies as much as they wanted David out of the way. Then he figured once David was out of the way that he would have the country, because he had already taken the loyalty of a lot of people in the country. So we'll start at verse 18. It says, "And Absalom met the servants of David, and Absalom rode upon a mule, and the mule went under the thick boughs of the oak, and his head was caught up in the oak, and he was taken up between the heaven and the earth, and the mule that was under him went away." First, and I didn't find it, to me it was a little bit odd that him aspiring to be the king was riding a mule instead of a horse. But I was thinking, when they went to fight this battle, they were in a very, very rough terrain. And David's men were used to that. As we know, we've studied with David, he had men of battle. These men had been, I'm sure some of these men had been with him when he was fighting against Saul and he was going throughout the country and hiding. But David's men were well-weathered warriors. Absalom had gotten together his army, so they didn't have the experience behind them that David's people had. And I was thinking, maybe Absalom was riding a mule because it was more sure-footed and maybe even smaller when you're in these wooded areas, because if you've rode horses before, they do try to take you under trees, and they do try to pull you off on trees by your head or your leg or whatever, get you off of them. They don't really care. They just want you off. And if, you can read something or study it over and over, and it seems like every time you look at it, something is new to you. But I notice it says, and the mule went under the thick boughs, and his head was caught hold of the oak. You always hear, if we remember last week we talked about him, when we talked about how handsome he was, how perfect physically, that he had no blemish on him, and he had this beautiful head of hair, if we remember. And it seems like I'd always thought, saw him, that it was his hair that was hanging up on the things. But it said that his head was caught. So the writer in this book was saying probably, like between a tree branches or something that he took. And he couldn't get himself down. But once he got up there, and it says, and the mule that was under him went away. And that's something that they don't have a lot of concern for you when you go off. So in verse 10, it says, "And a certain man saw it and told Joab and said, Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak." So a man came upon him and saw him hanging there, and he didn't help him or he didn't hurt him at that time. He kept his hands off of him. And in verse 11 it says, "And Joab said unto the man that told him, And behold, thou sawest him, and why didst thou not smite him there to the ground? And I would have given thee 10 shekels of silver and a girdle." So he's offering him some really valuable things. Said, why didn't you do this? You would be a rich man. I would have given you silver. And the girdle was a piece of the armor that they wore that was a really prized possession. If we remember when Jonathan and David had met, when Saul was after David, and Jonathan had given David pieces of his, like his robe, and he had given him his girdle and stuff as to kind of tie their friendship. And it was, a very prized possession that he gave him. And he's saying, I would have given you would have been a really famous man if you'd done this, and you'd be rich, and I would have given you something that you you could have hung up in your house and had to look at when you do it. In verse 12 it says, "And the man said to Joab, Though I should receive 1,000 shekels of silver in mine hand, yet would I not put forth my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king charged thee and Abishai and Ittai, saying, Beware that none touch the king." So if we read the verses in between this week and last week, David had met with the warriors in his group, and he had told them, and he had especially told the leaders of his forces, we are going out, and from if you read, David expected to win this. David knew he was the anointed king of Israel, and he expected that he would win. He didn't want to take his child's life in spite of that. So he made sure that everybody heard, do not hurt my son when you do this. Take him and end this revolt, but don't do this. So we see that this man had heard that, and he wasn't going to touch him, even though he might become rich by it. And there's some things out in life that we see that maybe opportunities to make money or something that doesn't go along with God's will, that if we do, we're not going to be the better for it once we do it. We might have a lot of money, but we might have a whole lot more sorrow and heartaches and miss heaven over it. That is not worth doing. So this man knew that, and he wasn't willing to make that sacrifice for riches or whatever it might be. And verse 13 says, "Otherwise I should have wrought falsehood against mine own life, for there is no matter hid from the king, and thou thyself would have set thyself against me." So he's saying, I know that it would have cost me my life had I done that. I'm not willing to do it. And he even told Joab, and it's something, to go tell the commander of the army. He said, "And thou thyself would have set yourself against me." And he's telling Joab, and if I had done it, you would have punished and said, I killed the king's son. And, and he realizes you would have killed me over doing it just to appease David because he had lost his son. So, this man had his thoughts right, it seemed, when he went into this and what he was doing. In verse 14 it says, "Then said Joab, I may not tarry thus with thee. And he took 3 darts in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak tree." So Joab didn't have these tender feelings toward Absalom, or it didn't appear that he had the fear of the king's wrath, because he went, back to where Absalom was, and he thrust darts through his heart. And, it was, I'll get to this a little bit. It says, "And the 10 young men that bare Joab's armor compassed about and smote Absalom and slew him." So not only did Joab go and put those darts in him, which didn't quite kill him, and we don't know, because this man had seen him hanging, had gone and told Joab, then they got back. So, there's no telling what kind of condition he was in that time, how he was hanging. Maybe he was hanging, you would think he was a strong young man that in most positions he could have got himself out of, but somehow he must have been hanging where he couldn't release himself. So he had been like that for quite some time. And we see that Joab, having no sympathies for him at all, it said thrust through him with these darts, but apparently it didn't kill him even at that point. So Absalom has, this hasn't turned out well for him, his plan of what he's done. It says, "And the 10 young men that bare Joab's armor also slain." In the lesson it says, "They were so slashed and mutilated under the swords of Joab's 10 men that no one could have told that it was Absalom that lay there. This was God's judgment on the young man's vanity. Absalom was very unfit to die. He was a man of an abandoned character. He was an assassin, a murderer of his own brother Amnon. He was a rebel against the king whom God himself had called to the throne, even against his own father. So, Absalom had gotten himself in a really bad state of mind, had done some very evil things that even, against the Lord, he was willing to go and kill the Lord's anointed. And we remember when we studied about Saul, when we first started, that when he was after David, and even after David had been anointed by Samuel as the king, David wasn't willing to take Saul's life. He had opportunities. Remember, he found him in the cave, and David was hid in the back of the dark cave, and Saul had no idea that he was in there, and David could have easily killed him, but he wouldn't kill the anointed of the Lord. Absalom didn't have this. And last week, I can't help but think back last week when Absalom was plotting to start this. He told David, let me go back to Hebron. I want to go back there, and I want to praise the Lord and go back and thank him. I don't think that would have made the Lord happy. He had no intent of going back there and being thankful to the Lord. He just used that because he knew David's feelings toward the Lord, and that would be something that David was for sure going to say, okay, go do that, because, that he held praise for the Lord in the highest esteem, which Absalom apparently didn't, and wasn't beyond pretending that he did it to do that. So, and we can see at this point that Absalom wasn't in good standing with the Lord even at the time. And Absalom didn't have a lot of time, or I guess he did have a lot of time to repent, but this came upon him so fast that, did he even think he was struggling for his life or whatever? But these judgments came upon him, and, that makes us think that we need to get these things right before all these terrible things befall us, that we're trying to fight, this and that and one thing after the other. But Absalom had kind of piled these sins on each other, and from anything we read, we don't see that he had done anything out of sorrow. And we look here that as far as what he thought about his father, it says, moreover, for the express purpose of making himself abhorred by his father and of precluding all possibility of reconciliation with him, he went into all his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. So in the reading between last week and this week, that is something that he did. David had, if we remember, when he had left Jerusalem, he left some of his concubines there because he was going to return. And Absalom took these concubines and was with him, it says, in the sight of all Israel. So he's done some really ugly things toward his dad. Any kind of hurt that he thought he could put, or any mark or blemish on David's thing, Absalom's done it all. He's had a couple years to think all this out, and he has become as terrible in the sight of his father as he could possibly be. Before then, he took and took the lives of people over. It's not something now that's just affecting David and Absalom, as we've talked before. A lot of our sins are far-reaching and more than that. In verse 16 it says, and Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing after Israel, for Joab held back the people. So once Absalom was done, the battle was done. He was the sole instigator of it. Joab stopped. He stopped the killing at that point. He told his people, don't go after these other Israelites that have been with Absalom, because they realized that their hearts had been stolen away by this deceit, but that they truly weren't the enemy that they were fighting at this point. So Joab stopped that. in verse 17, it says, "And they took Absalom and cast him into a great pit in the wood, and laid a very great heap of stones upon him. And all Israel fled, every one to his tent." It says he was buried in a shameful grave, in contrast with the splendid monument which in his lifetime he had taken and reared up for himself. He is now buried as an outlawed evildoer, as an outcast from among men. So if we think about it, he had put up a big statue of himself when he thought he was going to become king, and he had great thoughts of who he was and what he was going to do and his life, and I'm sure he kind of in his mind had thought about what his kingdom was going to be and all he was going to have and all he was going to do as king. But even beside that, if he had I don't know the words, gone along, been the son that we would think he should have been as the king's son, he would have had a very honorable burial as part of the king's children, or he would have had a royal, he's got royal blood in him, and he wouldn't have had this shameful stoning, thrown under a pit of stones outside the city where nobody knew. And it says it was a shameful burial at the time for what he had done. It was talking about violations of the commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. For the most part, indeed, escape the judgment of human authorities, but the Almighty has reserved it to himself to inflict punishment with his own hand. And at the end when of the commandment, honor thy father and thy mother, that it may go well with thee. So part of the honor of your parents is a promise from the Lord that it will go well with thee. And we see that Absalom didn't honor his father for sure. We don't know about his mother, but he for sure, and it didn't go well with him. So he broke the commandment, and the Lord didn't break the promise that he had made toward this commandment. So we're going to skip a few verses between here we're going to go to verse 32. And it says, "And the king said unto Cushai," I'm not sure how to say these names, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" And Cushai answered, "The enemies of my lord the king, and all that rise against thee that do thee hurt, be as the young man is." So, David, and rightly so, we all know, he's concerned about his son. When they come back and tell him, he wants to, he didn't say, "Is my army all right? How many people in my army did I lose?" He wanted to know how Absalom was. And his parents, that's probably going to be what any of us would do when they were going to be out, even though we may be over a lot of stuff. And if our child's involved in it, your first thought's going to be, is my son or my daughter okay from that? And that's what David said. And this was something that, according to the writer in the book, it says, "It is not uncommon for worthless sons who have lost all affection and dutifulness toward their parents to have parental love still lavished and wasted upon them." So it's saying, a lot of times when these kids do this rebellion and they do all these things, and they even do it specifically against the parents, that the parents continue to lavish love upon them, that they don't change how they feel. And it says, "The reprobate is not infrequently the favorite." And I know you've probably seen families that maybe have multiple children or two or whatever, but that some of the kids are, seem to be very well. They do everything they can to help the parents. They're doing well. They have jobs and they help them. But there might be one child that's kind of the wild card that has issues and takes money from the parent, and doesn't have any regard, that kid might even be the favorite of all of them. that they do. And, it's just something with children that, according to the situation, you don't stop loving them when they do something bad. Sometimes, you think if you continue to go along with what they're doing, that it's not always to their best interest to do that. But we see it does happen. It says, and the king was much moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. As he went, thus he said, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I have died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son." So, David is mourning. The people are saying that David is mourning, "Oh, my son, Absalom, Absalom." As we read in the chapters that we didn't go through, it talks about 20,000 men that had been killed in this battle. And, David's mourning Absalom, who caused this battle and caused the death of those. It said, moreover, Absalom had died suddenly and by violence and in sinful war against his father, unrepentant, unforgiven. David might even in his passionate grief, reflect on himself as the occasion, however innocently, of his death, since it rose from the measure he had taken in defense of himself and his throne. So it's, David had to be sorry, thinking maybe I shouldn't even have gone out after him to war. But, Joab comes back in and tells him, your mourning is affecting the people. They see you, they know that you're mourning your son, but it appears that you have no regard for your kingdom right now, that it's all about Absalom and it's all about your grief over him, that you don't. So, Joab had to really give him a wake-up call of what he was doing, because all of this that involved them had spread outside his family into his kingdom. So that this festering sin that we've seen has gotten, we'd said it was kind of like a cancer, it has gotten really big and infected a whole lot more than just that small start that it had. And the lesson writer said something in here, and I wouldn't have thought about it. Let me see. It says, you well know how God marked his indignation against Eli for this very thing. We remember the priest Eli has said his fault was not that he encouraged his sons to sin, but that he did not exert himself with sufficient energy to reclaim them. Remember, Eli was the priest, and his sons were in the temple, and they were eating the meat. They were taking what the people were bringing in front of the Lord. They were taking the choice things and eating them, and they were doing things that were strictly against the Lord's will. And Eli didn't do anything to change it. He didn't stop these sons. And if we recall that they were killed, and then Eli was smitten down at the same time. So it's saying, that Eli had encouraged them to sin, but he hadn't done anything to stop it either. So we think, we still always have a responsibility toward our children one way or the other. In the back of the book, it said, points to ponder. It says, the wages of sin is death. This is Reamer Loomis, I'm not sure, wrote this, but it said, the wages of sin is death. Thank God I quit before payday. So, I thought that was good. And it says, sin may be clasped so close we cannot see its face. Once we, and even especially like we've said, with a child involved, sometimes it's hard for us to see. People outside might be trying to tell us what we should be seeing, but when it's our kids, sometimes we can't, we can't see what's going on. Wanted to read you one last thing in the teacher's guide. I thought it was really good for parents. It says, if this be a lesson to children from the doom of Absalom, the lesson to parents is not less manifest in the case of David. The early battle between the child's will and the parents is often very difficult and trying, but God is on the parent's side and will give him the victory if he seeks it aright. It certainly needs great vigilance, wisdom, patience, firmness, and affection. If you are careless and unwatchful, the child's will speedily assert itself. If you are foolish and carry discipline too far, if you thwart the child at every point instead of insisting on one thing or perhaps a few things at a time, you will weary him and weary yourself without success. So it's saying, rearing a child is really hard. There's kind of an even keel on how you correct them and how much you expect them to progress, that you don't throw everything on them at once. It's saying that you take it slowly, or both of you are going to become weary, and then sometimes the child's strong will override all that's done. It says if you are fitful, insisting at one time and taking no heed at another, you will convey the impression of a very elastic law, not entitled to much success. And this is always what I think is the secret. So it's saying if something's okay one day and it's bad the next, if you're not consistent within your rules, says that it becomes very elastic, not entitled to much respect, and that's exactly what the children, there's not a lot of respect. If you lose your temper and speak unadvisedly instead of mildly and lovingly, you will most effectually set the child's temper up against the very thing you wished him to do. If you forget that you are not independent agents, but have got the care of your beloved child from God and ought to bring it up in God's stead and in the most humble and careful dependence on God's grace, you may look for blunder upon blunder in sad succession, with results in the end that will greatly disappoint you. So, it's saying do it with mercy toward the child, do it consistently, don't be in anger toward the child, and of utmost importance, take it to the Lord. Ask the Lord for help in rearing this child. It says, for if you don't depend on, you will look for blunder upon blunder in sad succession. And as we know, that's easy to happen because nobody gave us a book on how to be good parents. Sometimes you wish there was one that you could turn to a certain page, but we need to ask the Lord for help in instructing us, and sometimes in help, because sometimes you do get really angry with what they do, and there's, like I say, there's no rule book, or there was no training other than maybe what we saw from our parents that before, and how they dealt with stuff, and sometimes that may be good or bad at how they did. So y'all want to answer a couple questions? Anybody have anything to add to the lesson today, or any thoughts about this situation? Okay. Let me see. Sorry, I was on a different set of questions, and I'm thinking, we didn't talk about any of this stuff. It says, where did David and Absalom's armies meet? Sounded like an old, if you ever watch those movies with knights and stuff in them, and the old forests look all scary and haunted and stuff, and apparently this was a lot like that, because the trees must have hung so thick that that you would die over it. How did the forest aid in the defeat of Absalom's army? Right. So it kind of incapacitated the commander-in-chief. To put it mildly, yes, he was in a bad situation. How did Absalom meet his end?
Well, they Jewish guards that's what actually killed him.
And then the other man jumped on him, so he had a bad end. Why did
Pretty much the tree entrapped him, made him easy prey.
and then he was gone. The tree kind of weakened him, and I guess anybody at that point could have taken him. It says, why did the man refuse to kill Absalom?
Because he was David's son and David was king.
Yep. And David had told them specifically, don't kill my king. What was Absalom's spiritual condition when he died? From what we can tell by what we read. No, that he was just intent on murder. It's all we know. Yeah. But what we know, it doesn't say, or maybe when Abner came up, he could have said, "Forgive me," but there's no record that he did it. How was he buried? Yeah. So, in effect, he was kind of stoned, which that was a very bottom, shameful death. I guess not unlike the cross that our Lord was put on as a shameful death. It says, why did David grieve so much over his death? That's a given if you're a parent. Yes, it's your child. What more hurtful thing could be done? And David even said when he was grieving, why couldn't it have been me? Why couldn't I have been the one that died? It says, what lessons may parents learn from this history?
Well, the lesson is, raise the children right. Don't expect them to be right if you don't raise them right.
Right. That's a good. Yeah. Spare the rod and spoil the child, and don't expect them to be right if you haven't taken, because they are, they're really moldable at the time, and whatever, if they see anger from you or love or inattention or whatever it may be, that's where they're going to go from that point on. So, all right. Well, thank you all. See you next week for Sunday school, but at 11 o'clock for our service this morning. I'm home.
See you, Jane.
Feeling better?